Now that you understand the importance of listening and how it has real consequences for us, and some of them can be very costly, and how it affects how we negotiate meaning with others in our relationships, and how it's complicated through things like the knowledge economy and technologies, I want you to then shift your focus to how we have learned basically what we've learned about listening, and how we're going to continue to learn more about this process. We're going to study how scholars have researched listening and how that affects what we know. Now, there have been several different types of assessments. Those are things like surveys and research methods that have been used in order to gather information about the listening process. Early research really began in 1926 with Rankin's doctoral thesis. In his thesis, and actually in the appendix, there was a measure for how to go about measuring listening. And in the 1950s and 1960s is when you really saw basically a surgence in listening research, and it was primarily focused on kind of paper and pencil tests. Like, for example, you might have a public speaking situation or a class lecture situation, so the listening context was primarily one-to-many, and then you had been given a paper and pencil test in order to assess whether or not you could comprehend and recall what was discussed in the presentation. And these types of listening tests obviously are very effective for things like public speaking, but not necessarily for other different types of listening contexts, such as interpersonal communication or small group communication. Examples of these kinds of standardized tests that were really formed in the 1950s were the Brown-Carlson Listening Comprehension Test, and that was a test that was developed during that period in time, and also the Sequential Test of Educational Progress. Now, these two tests are actually still around today, but a lot of progress has been made to how we test listening, and it's really opened and broadened how we test listening to encompass not just one-to-many, but one-on-one and small group communication. And in the 1980s, it really marked a transition to more interactive listening research and also more reliable results for the kinds of research that are being conducted. And you have the development of the Watson-Barker test and the Kentucky Comprehensive Listening Test, which really interestingly started to test things like nonverbal communication and how people responded to things like paralinguistic cues, changes in your tone of voice and your rate and your volume, and how that affected the listening process altogether. And there are a number of other tests that have developed since then. You have things like a listening comprehension test, Jones-Moore listening test, the Michigan listening test, and like I said, I can keep going on. There have been a number of tests. And really what we're finding is that listening is opening up and the research is opening up, but even though it's opening up, there are some concerns that we have. For one, there's lack of clarity regarding listening as a construct. People define listening differently. Some people don't regard like, for example, reading to be listening, and so if you were to try to test listening in online chats, they wouldn't regard that as being listening because you'd be reading what somebody else wrote. And then some people would encompass that in listening, and so listening as a construct is very elusive because people define it differently. Also, some people, they really focus more on aspects of like interpreting, rather other people focus on aspects like recall. So with that differentiation, it can be very difficult in order to repeat results in listening research. Also, secondly, there's a lack of correspondence between the behaviors that are being assessed and those being taught. So, for example, in this textbook, we might have skills that are related to improving like auditory discrimination, or skills related to being able to evaluate messages more effectively. Yet, that's not necessarily what's being assessed in the listening research, and so there's a gap between there, and that gap really affects what we know and how we know it and where we can go from there. Thirdly, there's a use of written measures largely to assess behavioral dimensions, and what we need is more research that uses video recordings and audio recordings of conversations, group processes, so that we can really understand the interactive nature of communication and those behavioral dimensions. A big problem with that also is that it's difficult to study things like motivation and really know what someone's thinking throughout the listening process and oftentimes listeners are retrospectively making sense of what's going on, and so that can be very difficult as well. Even if you ask them questions after communication encounter, that encounter is still going to affect them much later, and so that's really difficult to measure as well. There's also difficulties in skill transfer, that is teaching someone a skill and then being able to observe that skill in practice, and how do we actually go out and observe that skill. So for example, in a class like this where you're being taught listening skills, how do I observe that you're actually learning them? How do I know that? When I'm talking to you about how to improve listening in something like a romantic relationship, I'm not going to be able to observe you in that romantic relationship. So how would I be able to assess whether or not you effectively internalized the skills that are necessary to improve your effectiveness and then applied them in an appropriate way? That's quite difficult. Also, it's really difficult for us to assess things like motivation and how that affects listening improvement. So there is the law of listening, which helps us to look at listening motivation in terms of conceptualizing how it affects us. And it's ability plus willingness equals listening. And so if you flipped it around and started with listening equals ability plus willingness, that's how you could remember law of listening. Really, motivation, though, is poorly understood because people can have great abilities. That is, we can know all the right things to do right. We can know all the right things to say, but if we're not willing to make the applications of that, it doesn't really matter, does it? And so motivation becomes very important. There is a willingness to listen measure that is an assessment that you can use to conduct listening research. In fact, I am going to post one of those assessments. I believe it's next week, that's planned, where you'll take a willingness to listen measure. But the problem that relates to the willingness to listen measure is that one person can be thinking of a different listening context than another person taking the measure, and so when you then pull all the data together, it can be really hit or miss in different places. And what if people were thinking of a totally different context? Does that really make your data still valid? So there's some questions of validity related to the willingness to listen measure. And there are some challenges that face us as we continue to conduct research in listening. There's a lack of theoretical framework to guide our research. The Hurrier model that we're studying in this class is aimed at actually trying to help provide a framework for listening. So hopefully this will benefit listening research in the future. Also, the covert nature of the listening process can make it really complicated. It can be, like I said earlier, difficult to really know what someone's thinking, how they're processing information, especially in the understanding and interpreting processes in listening. Also, there's a lack of information sharing across disciplinary boundaries, and people study things that are related to listening in the all throughout the social sciences and even in business. So the fact that we don't share a lot of that information and don't conduct research together really impedes our progress. And just to wrap things up, this week you will be putting on the hat of a researcher, and you're going to be conducting some survey research related to listening. So this is your first chance of several in this class to be doing some listening research, so make sure you look for that on the discussion post and complete that assignment.